So hello and good morning. Thank you for being here with us today. My name is Moshta Jalaliar. I'm part of the Climate Partner Impact team, mainly responsible for our corporate partnerships and market development topics. And I'm very delighted to moderate today's session here at the Capacity Building Hub. This space truly embodies the spirit of collaboration, a stage where we can share our knowledge, and also it's a platform for creating new partnerships. Climate action is work in progress, and though perhaps not progressing as fast as we'd like it, and as some recently said it, we need to stop walking and start running as fast as we can to achieve the goals we have committed ourselves to. And there's basically no one-size-fits-all solution, and the escalating threat, or basically what's actually reality of climate change, demands urgent and collective actions from all stakeholders and worldwide. And among these stakeholders, corporations have a pivotal role due to their significant contributions to global emissions and their influential positions on supply chains and also consumer behaviors. And as major emitters, businesses bear a responsibility to actively reduce their carbon footprint, adopt sustainable practices, and also foster innovation and cleaner technologies, for example. However, the impact of corporate climate action extends beyond businesses' direct operations and value chains. And recognizing the need for additional measures, many companies use the voluntary carbon market to complement their internal emission reduction efforts. And via this market, corporations provide much needed funding to climate projects that reduce or avoid greenhouse gas emissions, for example, with reforestation initiatives. And in general, there's a huge need for transformative changes, and such changes not only require efforts, but also they demand also an innovative mindset and a new set of tools and skills to embody and accelerate our path to global net zero. And this is why I deeply value the opportunity we have here today to engage in an innovative and forward-looking capacity building session. And so what will be the session, what will be the focus on today's session? We aim to explore the role of the private sector in closing the financial gap. We will examine also new innovative approaches, which the VCM and innovative approaches within the VCM, and how they can basically close the implementation and ambition gaps of the host countries. The question is around how the private and public sector mainly can collaborate more efficiently, and what kind of tools and knowledge sharing mechanisms are necessary for this. And basically also from a policy perspective, we also have to look into how corporate climate contribution align with the rules of the Paris Agreement. And to address these topics, we will first hear an introduction to the contribution approach from my colleague Lena. Lena Koch is a carbon market policy advisor at Climate Partner Impact. Climate Partner Impact is a project developer based in Munich and is focusing on developing projects in the global south, such as nature-based solutions or such social impact projects. And after Lena's presentation, we will dive into the panel discussion with our panelists today. And thank you once again for being here with us, and I would like to ask Lena to join me.
Thank you very much, Moshta, and a very warm welcome also from my side. I do apologize for my voice. I hope I'm audible well enough. So before we start with the panel discussion, I'd like to take the next 10 minutes or so to talk about the general concept of contributions, voluntary contributions through the carbon market by corporates. So this graph I'd like to start with, I'm sure you've all seen it many times in many forms. This one is from the Climate Action Tracker, and it shows our emissions gap. And we see that we're very far from the 1.5 degree pathway. This is not exactly a surprise. The targets are not ambitious enough to be on the 1.5 degree pathway, and the policies that are in place to implement those are also not even enough to meet those targets. If we look at it a little bit more closely on those different gaps, so there's what we refer to as the action gap or the implementation gap, which is the gap between the policies and the NDCs, the national targets. So there is not enough policies or not enough funding available usually in many countries to meet their national targets. And that's not all. Even the targets that are in place are not ambitious enough to remain or get to the 1.5 degree pathway. I mean, the next updated NDCs are due next year, so hopefully we'll see this gap to become a little smaller, but yeah, we're still a long way off. And I mean, what do we need to close these gaps, and what's the top agenda item at COP this year? It's finance and the NCQG, so the new collective quantified goal of climate finance. So the high-level expert group on climate finance has published a report on what is needed to finance the green transition. And in fact, just last week here in Baku, they updated this report. The numbers I have on the slide are still pretty much the same though. So they do say we need $2.4 trillion annually for the green transition. If you remember, previously we had to 100 billion. And I think only ever one year it was actually reached. And according to the OECD, only around 20% or so of that came from the private sector. Now, the high-level expert group says that now in this NCQG, at least $500 billion annually should be coming from the private sector. And they also do state that carbon markets are a very effective tool actually to channel some finance in many sectors into this private finance target. And in this new updated version from last week, they specifically also mentioned the voluntary carbon market as an effective tool. Now, I know that this is a controversial topic, so I just want to be crystal clear. If we talk about the voluntary carbon market in this case, we by no means say that it should replace national pledges in any way. It should always be in addition to national pledges, so that's very important. Yeah, but the private sector has a responsibility and it has the money, so it needs to pay. But also, if we look at each individual company internally, ideally they have emission reduction targets. Ideally, they have a net zero target as well. Now, I know that is unfortunately still very few companies globally, but let's just assume the best case scenario, a company that has an ambitious target, net zero by 2050. So they would need to decarbonize within their own value chain year after year as much as they can to reach net zero by 2050. Now, of course, it's very unlikely that they will actually be able to reach zero emissions. So the residual emissions, then they will need to neutralize through carbon removals. And that's great, and that's very ambitious, and that's more than most are doing right now, unfortunately. But still, even then, of course, there is still remaining emissions year after year until we reach that net zero state in 2050. So these are the emissions that we see here in gray. And the companies are still responsible for these emissions and should still do something about this. And while they have efforts to decarbonize internally, they should in addition engage in beyond value chain mitigation, so finance mitigative action outside of their own value chain. And carbon markets are a very effective tool to do that. Corporates can engage in different kinds of carbon markets, so basically within the UN system in Article 6 or through the voluntary carbon market and voluntary contributions. What do I mean by Article 6 here? I refer specifically to authorized credits under 6.2, 6.4, or also voluntary credits that have received an authorization by the host country. And these credits, these authorized credits, are primarily meant for direct bilateral cooperation between countries. They can also be used for other compliance purposes, for example, for CORSIA, or also by voluntary buyers that do not have any obligations if they, for some reason, wish to have authorized credits. For example, if they want to claim carbon neutrality or offsetting or compensating. And in the case of a voluntary buyer buying authorized credits, this would help in closing the ambition gap because it would then be outside of any national targets and go beyond that and, yeah, help close the ambition gap. Then secondly, the voluntary contribution, and that's what we really want to talk about today. By this, we mean unauthorized credits from the voluntary carbon market, but here this could also potentially be other measurable outcomes like biodiversity or, for example, plastic, water credits. And I guess the main difference is that here there is no ownership of the achieved outcome by the corporate buyer, and it is more of a, it should be considered a support of a host country's NDC or support of overall global climate mitigation. That depends really on the sector and on the country. So if the activity in the host country is within the conditional NDCs, so if they have the policy in place but are lacking the funding, then this would help in closing the implementation gap. But if it goes beyond, for example, if it's a very high-hanging fruit in this country, then it would also help in closing the ambition gap. And why we want to focus on these voluntary contributions by corporates today is that we see many advantages for the corporates and the host countries. But also, I mean, we all know that Article 6 negotiations are currently ongoing. They have been ongoing for many years. We have seen some successes earlier last week, and I guess it still remains to be seen where we'll end up at the end of this week. But independent of that, a voluntary contribution by a corporate can already be made today regardless of any outcomes. Although there is also a space for contributions in the 6.4 mechanism. The 6.4 mechanism recognizes this as well through mitigation contribution emission reduction credits. But because there is no ownership of the credit in this case, it's really about the company taking responsibility of their emissions while supporting the host countries as well. And here, and I hope that we'll hear some insights from our speakers later, it's really about the honest and transparent communication of the engagement of the company. This concept is not exactly a new concept. Many organizations have done amazing work on this. Some of them are here with us today, and I'm excited that we'll hear about their approaches later. Now I guess it's really about aligning those concepts, convincing the corporate sector to get engaged in this concept, and then also getting closer together and in partnerships with the host countries to really look where are the capacities needed, where are the gaps in their NDCs, where do they lack funding. So it's really about these partnerships that we need to build between the private sector and the host countries here. Yeah, so that's the general concept. And with that, I would like to hand over back to Moshta and to our panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena, a lot for this insightful introduction. And now that we have a little bit food for thought, I would like to ask our panelists to join me here at the stage. I think, unfortunately, we're missing one person, Rita Renner. Maybe he's running late, but we will definitely start now. So I'd like to do a little introduction. So welcome, Ingi. Dr. Ingi Johnston is a research fellow in net zero aligned offsetting at the University of Oxford and an associate member of St. Anthony's College. And Ingi was the lead author of the second version of the CDR report and the revised Oxford offsetting principles. Then we have James Daniels. Welcome, James. James is the CEO of Regit Carbon, a carbon technology company based in Nairobi, Kenya, and it's specialized in Earth observation, engineering, landscape, and MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification. And now I see Peter Renner. Maybe you would like to join us here at the stage, Peter? Good morning, Peter. Hi. Thank you for joining us, Peter. Peter is the chair of the Foundation Development and Climate Alliance, which is funded by the German government. And the principle behind the alliance is that companies, institutions, and organizations promote climate protection projects. And last but not least, we have Sophia Johnson-Veloso. Sophia is a carbon market analyst at Climate Partner Impact, and she has been leading the contribution approach and product development within the company, and she is an expert on carbon markets. Sorry? I have already. So welcome all of you again, and thanks for joining us and being with us here. I would like to start with Inji. The Oxford Net Zero principles for offsetting support basically companies to guide their climate strategies and net zero claims. And with that in mind, how do you see the newly emerged contribution claim narrative? And is this in line basically with the Oxford Net Zero principle or something completely opposed to them?
Testing, yes. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's a great question. We get it a lot. So, you know, the Oxford Offsetting Principles were released back in September 2020, 4 principles, but we went through a period of revision for the last 2 years and released a revised version in February of this year. There's 4 principles. I'll run through them very quickly just so we're all kind of level set. But so the first is to cut your emissions, ensure the environmental integrity of credits used, and revise your offsetting strategy regularly. The second is to transition to carbon removal-based offsetting by the net zero target date. The third is to ensure that carbon removal is durable, to ensure that the emissions are actually stored on a timescale commensurate with climate change. And fourthly, it's to stimulate an innovative and integrative net zero aligned offsetting ecosystem. And it's that fourth one that in particular I think there's a really strong role for contribution approaches. But actually, if you look at figure 3 in our offsetting principles, we define compensation approaches up to addressing your residual emissions on a ton-for-ton basis, and then a contribution is when you go beyond that. We feel that that fits societal expectations and kind of consumer thoughts on when you're kind of describing a more contribution-based approach. But really, I think we're excited to kind of really think about the space a little bit differently, because we do see that definitions, to come back to the earlier presentations, can hold us back. And I think we just need to be really clear about when we're talking about crediting mechanisms and what those are used for versus the kind of catalytic climate finance as well. Both are needed, both at the public scale, but crucially also the private scale. So I'll pause there.
Thank you, Anju. Very interesting, and also good to hear that those are also aligned with the Oxford Net Zero principle, and basically you're also promoting beyond value chain mitigation in this sense. And maybe we're going next with Peter. Your foundation, together with the Wuppertal Institute in Germany, has recently published a paper on contribution claims. And can you please tell us about this, your positioning and on contribution claims in this sense?
Yeah. Published by us, because it's our project. We started the project and designing the project already in 21, because we always realized that we have to improve ambition and also the standards and the design of compensation projects, let me say. In 21, we discussed this internally with our experts and set up a terms of reference and contacted then a think tank, in this case, indeed, Wuppertal Institute, and set up a research project then running for 2 years. And finally, we got the guidelines, which we published, that's right, in September this year. Why did we so? We felt already, as I already mentioned, that the criticism of the compensation project started. There were some loopholes. We always discussed this on several panels and meetings, also with the community, with the project designers, with the investors, with the local communities in the different countries in the global south. And when the campaign started by Guardian and Decide and others in early 2020, 22, then we found, okay, that's the right point to open a third way between the offsetting and the philanthropy, so going in the middle, and offer the community, the potential investors, a third way for doing some positive things and giving an impact to the communities by setting up such high-leveled, ambitious climate protection projects, which have a huge impact also for the community and the Agenda 2030.
Thank you so much, Peter. I think this is also very important to really highlight the additional benefits for the local communities and the impact on the ground with this additional corporate finance. And maybe also going back and in this sense to ask, like, how do corporate contributions through the voluntary carbon markets basically benefit both the host countries and also the project developers? And I would like to ask you and hear your opinion, Sophia.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So the goal of the voluntary carbon market, or one of the objectives, really is to funnel that private sector finance into the host countries and the projects on the ground. And by doing that, obviously the projects, they receive the support that they need to have successful implementation. And by incorporating these systems, these voluntary carbon market systems, into the national policy frameworks, then the national jurisdictions have the opportunity to better manage their own emissions inventory. And they also have the opportunity to use these mechanisms to support their own NDCs, and either to support their own NDCs by using this new contribution approach, or if they prefer, to issue corresponding adjustments and allow these emission rights or these carbon rights to be exported out of the country. So really the countries have these two different options here to choose between, and by incorporating this new mechanism into the national policy framework, they can really regulate that in a good way.
Thank you, Sophia. And you just talked about the opportunities, but maybe there are also some barriers and difficulties. And I would like to ask you, Daniel, since you have in the past have worked with several host countries to better understand the voluntary carbon market, but also in their own goals, but also to find new the necessary structures and processes to utilize basically the voluntary carbon market for them. And in this regard, can you elaborate or tell us a bit about the key barriers and difficulties you see host countries are facing?
Thank you, Marta. I want to thank you for putting this really important conversation today. Coming from my introductory side, Rigid Carbon is a company that was targeted a couple of years ago towards delivering MRV services. We could have been a validation and verification body, but up until we saw how the markets were kind of transitioning, we found a new scope in the market, which was to utilize tech to structure how finance can sit, creating a dynamic ecosystem to allow receiving countries, together with host countries, to find comfortability in the flow of investment towards carbon specifically. One thing we've noticed working with about 6 or so different governments in the past couple of years was that there is limitation within the public entities representing the governments in host countries, specifically on what does it mean in establishing our flow of resources? How do we structure our statutory instruments to give us that particular confidence? So what I'm driving at is that there is issues related to human capital, really understanding not only the operation of the voluntary carbon markets, but I think it's really the commercialization aspect of it. Now, I like what the UNFCCC's framework has brought to us, which is a very high level and decent way to, regulate the market. But when it gets down to the specifics of how to make a transactable carbon ecosystem, then we've utilized tech a lot to guide governments, and we're continuously doing that education to governments, capacity building, exchanging, understanding those pain points, and coming back. So some of the sectors we've put forward is a follow sector. I think our tech was primarily, designed for that. But as well, we're looking into other nature-based removals, where we're really targeting and saying, hey, I want to put $10 million, but could you please show me the how I'm going to get my return? It's okay, everybody can come up with financial models, but if it's not informed by a proper tech ecosystem, where you're talking about quality data to inform exactly what your ERs are going to look like, lumping that in a detailed due diligence protocol, we're basically using that to create carbon as an asset class, to pull in investors, to pull in governments into one table and say, at the back of my ad, this is the natural resource I got, this is the value it has, and if I'm going to ask for $1, this is where I can put on it confidently that this class is transactable, this level is not, and this could go into non-market approaches. So we basically use that to segment between opportunities that could go to Article 6.2, 6.4, and of course the 6.8 process.
Thank you, James. So it's really, there is a kind of a broad base where you can use it, and it's not only about the why, but also about the how. And you also mentioned, for example, the tech, utilizing tech or digital tools, for example, which are really important. And also in terms of public-private partnerships, we see that there is a high potential for this. And maybe bringing the corporate perspective back in, Indy, do you think that basically contributions without offsetting at all could be a part of a company's net zero journey? Or basically can they be replaced completely?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And this is why I think the language around compensation and contribution can be helpful in terms of that. I understand that contribution is definitely more positive framing and compensation more negative. But I think, again, it's coming back to, are we talking about crediting mechanisms, or are we talking about cooperative and catalytic climate finance? So if we're talking about contributions as crediting mechanisms, I think absolutely you can use those to address residual emissions and importantly to go beyond. But then also in terms of going beyond, I think the role of catalytic climate finance plays a role too. And we see both pathways through Article 6, but importantly, as acknowledged by the presentation, the kind of entire voluntary ecosystem can still exist outside of Article 6. So there will be some implementation bumps in the road, I think, as we'll see over the next few years, and I think it's really important to steer course through that, through this focus on, are we crediting, and what are we, how are we determining those thresholds? Often it is in relation to residual emissions still, so that's like the former classic compensation claim, but we're seeing some contribution claim style movement in that space, but then also looking beyond and saying, how can corporates not only leverage catalytic climate finance, but truly their whole value chain towards the net zero transition that's in line with Article 2.1c, but more broadly, an opportunity to kind of repivot towards not only looking at net zero as a limitation, but truly a business opportunity to kind of reorient value in the supply chain.
I really like that, mentioning the catalytic climate finance, but also showing that there are also basically new business opportunities here in this sense, and also for the host countries again. And Peter, do you see this opportunity of these contribution models to support host country NDCs?
Yes, of course. Otherwise, we wouldn't have done it. The point is, what we have to understand is, and this is for the projects from the compliance market, from the voluntary carbon market, after Article 6.2, 6.4, if a private investor is engaging in an ITMOS, at the end of the day, there is a project, and the project is set up in the communities. It's a nature-based project, and that's a problem. Because at the end of the day, the project says, okay, I'm compensating a certain amount of CO2 emissions, and to verify this clearly, transparent, reliable is not really easy. And as already James mentioned, and with another sentence as well, Ingi, is that at the end of the day, if I want to have really this impact for the communities in terms of climate protection, meaning compensation of the CO2 emissions, as well as the impact concerning the Agenda 2030, then it must be reliable. And that's why we should move a bit from the asset point of view, meaning I'm getting a certificate and doing this counting in my balance for the climate strategy and the sustainability strategy in order to get net zero, and focus on what could be for the for my contribution. And that's why we set up this and created a certain kind of strategy in order to define a CO2 price per ton, multiply with the amount I want to have, and then getting out of some which I'm getting then in investment in these kind of projects. And this is from our point of view, giving a huge impact for the communities as well as for the climate protection and the voluntary carbon market. I confess, yes, it's not really a business case yet. But first of all, we are working on, and at the end of the day, the need is to attract the private money for these kind of projects. Otherwise, we will fail with our objectives, Paris Agreement, as well as Agenda 2030. And that's this combination to attract the private money, to satisfy the investors, and to make the project. That's the point we are dealing with. And I think with our guideline we set off by setting up and defining such a project, we are a step further on, yes.
Thank you, Peter. So it's really about balancing and seeing the benefits of this additional private finance, but also seeing like there are still some stakeholders who see it as an asset, and there are basically a lot of opportunities and potential, but you also mentioned the term reliability, and I think in this sense it's really also important to stress the need for capacity building and trust building between the private and public sector. And there is definitely a role from the governments here in this case. And maybe Sophia, if you can say a few words about what do you think about what kind of role can governments, or specifically the host countries, play in this in order to unlock the potential of the corporate climate finance?
So I think the role of the host countries is really essential. This is where we're operating, this is where the projects are based. And for us to have successful projects on the ground, there really needs to be close collaboration between the projects themselves and the host country governments. And this can happen in many different ways. But I think, first of all, for us to even begin to design these projects on the ground and to have successful project outcomes, there needs to be well-designed regulatory frameworks in the countries. We need to see that the countries are developing these frameworks in collaboration with market stakeholders, so that the design of these frameworks enhance the market and support the market stakeholders. And therefore it's very essential, really, even before the projects begin, that there is a conversation between these stakeholders. And then in addition to that, once you do have that regulatory framework which sets the base of how to operate in the country, then you also really benefit from having a continued conversation. So really close public-private partnerships between the projects and the host countries to really ensure that there is an alignment and that the projects contribute to the interests of this national jurisdiction and are not operating sort of on their own. So I think really, just to summarize, what we would love to see is really that close conversation so that we can design a system that works for all of us.
Yeah. Thank you so much for bringing also this perspective that there is a kind of, even before the projects happen on the ground, there needs to be communication and capacity building in this sense, and also for a long-term partnership, basically. This is very important. And maybe you just mentioned now the needs from a project development perspective, basically, but maybe, Danielle, you can also, based on your experiences with host countries, what kind of solutions do you see recurring as preferred pathways to utilize the VCM?
So I just want to pick it up from where Sophia's left it, that creating these statutory instruments related to the policy framework that can facilitate flow of capital is one of the key areas where I think most of the efforts need to go into. But I would like to root it very carefully that currently, looking at the ecosystem for transactions in carbon, it's all, picking up from everything else that has happened in the traditional markets. So voluntary carbon markets can be the, still the playbook to guide how to domesticate and make the corresponding adjustment transaction environment more bankable. But essentially, continuous training and talking about what do we need to know before we sit, from the host country perspective, before we sit on the table to negotiate with receiving countries, is really understanding the potential of the mitigation outcomes that we have. So we've seen in our experiences, like I said, working with about 6 different governments, oftentimes we go to these discussions, we go to negotiations without really knowing exactly what we have at the back of the ad, and that makes us a little bit disorganized. So I would say getting more structured and utilizing the capabilities that we have from tech, from financial advisory side of things, and then trickling that down as to how it's going to sit in bringing up the social capital perspective. Because I think for host countries, it's very important that this flow of finance brings on a very strategic and targeted social capital building perspective. So if we can figure out carefully how to tie each of this human capital, tech and finance to bring on how we can, levelize the market ecosystem, particularly bringing on the type of social capital benefits that we've wanted to have, then I think it gives us a lot more confidence to go even at the time when we're requesting or asking for a price in terms of an investment. We already are quite, bankable to say, we're going to need so much to put into implementation of the project, but we're also very confident that the statutory instruments that come along are giving us the room. So giving that feedback to government as well is very critical. Sometimes it's taken, sometimes not, because governments also have their own public procurement protocols, which we have to comply if the market is supposed to remain competitive. But again, really staying on the sidelines and not giving up. I think that's the take home that I could bring up.
Thank you so much. I think this is really helpful. And maybe, Inji, from your perspective, do you share what James just said about the engagement of the government and host countries in this regard?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really critical, and I think it's kind of one of the major hamstrings even in this finance COP here with the NCQG is this real lack of clarity between what is the role of public and private financing, what do all the different articles under the Paris Agreement really do, and how do they move us forward? And I think it's really critical that governments, in consultation with stakeholders, really do establish these clear frameworks to understand and appreciate the role that Article 6 can do to enhance ambition, but equally to make sure that pressure's still on to utilize the frameworks under Article 5, results-based financing for carbon sinks, as well as Article 9 in terms of broader climate finance obligations. Because I think it's a mistake to kind of collapse all kind of financing into the lens of Article 6. We've seen it is a very technical piece of the Paris Agreement. It's taken nearly 9 years to negotiate for that reason. And I think that's why it's incredibly important to establish these clear frameworks for Article 6, but positioning that within the broader context of the Paris Agreement. And that way really unlocking what true public-private partnerships can look like, and truly how, readying this difference between the implementation gap and the ambition gap as well that was discussed earlier.
Thank you. You just mentioned the new collective quantified goals, and maybe just to take this up, a provision that encourages scaling the VCM has been included in the latest text on climate finance recently. And maybe Sophia, in your opinion, what is the best way to unlock this private corporate finance in this sense for the NCQG?
I think it's quite difficult to answer the question, what is the best way? But what I would like to respond to that is also mirroring a little bit what you just said. There are very many mechanisms available to sort of generate this finance that we need. And all of these mechanisms have a place. And it needs to be clear how each individual mechanism works on its own and how they come together to sort of fuel this change and this transition that we really need. So I think just to kind of put that together, I don't have a preferred mechanism. I don't think there is a best way to do it. But I do think that we have a lot of tools available to us. We have a very, very challenging task ahead, and we need a very ambitious finance goal. We need to generate as much finance as we possibly can to live up to this challenge, to meet this challenge. And to do that, we really need to utilize all the tools we have available. So the voluntary carbon market, Article 6, it is one of the tools available. We really need to make sure that it is well designed and that we use it in the best way possible, that we understand it well. And yeah, we really should utilize it, but not on its own, as a part of this holistic ecosystem.
Thank you so much, Sophia, and this sounds indeed very promising. And then if we have the back also from the corporates, I think then we are on a good path. And maybe Peter, from your perspective, since your organization, I mean, from large corporations to medium-sized companies, you have a wide range of supporters in your foundations. And do you think the private sector has the capacity and the willingness to include this approach, and how can it be more incentivized in this sense? What is out from your experiences, and what are your supporters are saying?
Well,
especially for the contribution approach.
Doesn't matter, but yes, of course, also for the contribution. The point is, we need integrity. Already mentioned, we need integrity from the guest country side, because it's really heavy to see if the administration has a lot of going through different steps which need really a high capacity and experts to decide, is this properly or not. We need integrity by designing the projects. These are done by the compensation partners, the consultancies, etc., and ambitious, and both must be integral, because at the end of the day, we won't find an investor if this integrity is not given yet. So that's the main point. The second point is that we need as much as we can attract private capital to reach our objectives. So if we not attract the private capital, we won't be successful. So this is the challenge we have to face. The third point here is we will get the money, and I'm absolutely convinced that the voluntary carbon market can boost on. The point is, it will not be done if we haven't first the integrity, I already talked, and of course, at the end of the day, in anyhow, an incentive, let me say, for the investors by giving the money. If I want to attract private capital, I have to give the private capital anything, so going back. So that's the point, and this is the difficulty all of us are discussing at the moment. We have some possibilities. I'm quite optimistic that we will lose the problem within a near factor. If this CAP will be successful, I'm looking forward that we will be able to set up the first project after Paris Agreement with early 26, because how to set up the methodology, a proper integrity methodology will keep us conversating and discussing during the next year. So, and if we can use this time with pragmatic conversation, I'm looking forward that we'll be successful in, let me say, anything about 15 months, yes.
Thank you, Peter. Do you want to add anything to that, or do you have any additional ideas to how can corporates be incentivized?
Absolutely. I do believe having walked the journey, trying to figure out potential public-private partnership structures that can expedite the market to, get a lot more vibrant. We see a lot more opportunities for continuous innovation in financial structures. And part of this is really about also working backwards, reverse engineering. What is the benefit that we want to take down to the local stakeholders? In what margins and for how long? If we can answer those questions and integrate them in the design framework, then we're going to utilize these mechanisms that we have, particularly rooted from the voluntary carbon market side. I would not look so much into the compliance market side of things under the UNFCCC's Paris Agreement, because there is still a work in progress for us to get to a point where countries can confidently transact. But one thing I got to give credit to is that we already have some statutory instruments, but how do we continuously innovate from the voluntary carbon markets to make these statutory instruments actually attractive to draw that flow of capital? Because believe it or not, we're continuously going to need to create that ecosystem within our own individual countries and then figure out what sources of investment can feel comfortable to sit on it. So innovation is always going to happen, but again, rooting from the successes we've had in voluntary carbon market.
Thank you, James. And maybe to wrap this up with a practical approach, Sophia, can you share an example of a successful beyond value chain mitigation project and an example from a corporation?
I can. So we do have a quite exciting project that I particularly like, which is a mangrove restoration project based in Kenya. And one of our clients, Radicant Bank, decided that they wanted to support this project. They are supporting the plantation of 20,000 seedlings. And this support that they are providing is not with the goal of doing compensation in this case, but rather as a contribution approach. So they are supporting the project, they're supporting the restoration of these seedlings in this mangrove ecosystem. And as an effect of it being a contribution as opposed to offsetting, obviously the carbon rights can stay in the country, which I think is quite exciting for all the parties involved. And Radicant Bank has been quite happy, I think, with this contribution and communicated it quite actively. So I think that also shows that there is an interest from the corporate sector to support this kind of initiatives, even without the need of getting the carbon rights. They are doing their internal reductions on their own, and I think that really shows that there is an interest.
Thank you thank you so much for sharing this with us. And we're coming to an end. And I think it's so far what I've heard is that there is a lot of potential for this contribution approach to really unlock additional private finance for such climate projects. And I heard a lot about partnerships using technological tools, digital tools, but also about capacity building in terms of knowledge sharing and really working more closer together with host countries. And to wrap this up, I'd like each of you to briefly share and maybe the key takeaways or points that resonates most with today's discussion with you. And maybe just like 3 bullet points of what should our audience take away from this conversation. Peter, maybe you want to start.
Okay, I will try. Well, I think from my point of view, and I would like to wish what we have transferred to the audience is that these kind of projects are a proper part of fighting against climate crisis. It's necessary to have an ambitious, transparent, and also compliant point of view by setting up the design of the projects, by cooperate and cooperate with the guest countries and the administration there, like Sophia or others already described. And at the end of the day, that I'm absolutely convinced if all of us think that climate crisis needs these things, meaning that we have then to pay for the products a bit more, that these projects can be set up, then we are on the right track.
Thank you, Peter. Maybe Sophia? Just like 3 very crispy bullet points.
Crispy ones. Okay, let me try. I think the key takeaways here is that, or for me personally, first of all, we have an ambitious goal to meet, and the interest from the corporate sector shows that they want to take part and they want to contribute, and they want to do it well. There is most of the conversations that we're seeing is with an ambition to do it well, and I think that if we can get the interactions between national jurisdictions and corporations, then we can really make sure that it is done well. So I think there's a lot of potential here, and I would also like to reiterate something that was mentioned a few times, which is the matter of integrity. Doing it well means ensuring integrity. We are not scared of having highly ambitious integrity regulations and best practices, and we do want to do it well. So we are looking at improving the systems that we have in place as much as we possibly can, and yeah, to meet this goal that we want to meet.
Thank you, Sophia. Minji, you want to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for me, one of the key takeaways is that whether we're talking about contribution or compensation, it's the same projects on the ground that do need robust support. Secondly, that we need to make sure that that those projects, climate mitigation, but also adaptation projects, are receiving the most kind of appropriate forms of finance in order to unlock the huge swathes of finance that are needed. And to that end, that we also shouldn't see competition between the ambition gap and the implementation gap. Again, we should get really clear where we're contributing and why, and I think there's really strong business case for both.
Last but not least, James.
Yeah, I think listening to everybody speak here today, one thing I could say is that figuring out how we can continuously leverage on human capital to bring a lot more comfortability. Carbon is not new. Within these host countries, there's been the exchange of certificates even before the Article 6 framework, but continuously looking back and pulling out those successful transactions to establish market ecosystems and then training governments in a way they can comfortably continuously involve in public-private partnerships, I think is a key success factor that I think we need to take forward. From the investment perspective, then I also know perhaps the entities that are structured here with giving public finance. I think that flow of public finance to help this human capital and innovations to come together in a perspective to make a commercial ecosystem around carbon, but not forgetting that this is just a mechanism. Our end goal is really to root down and address, the host country social capital needs. Needs to really go with us from this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing those key takeaways with us. And maybe I would like to ask our audience if you have any questions. We can maybe probably take 1 or 2 questions. Yes. Do we have an additional microphone or?
Thank you very much for the moderator as well as the panelists, which is explaining about, the carbon markets, especially on the voluntary carbon market issues. My question is, when I'm thinking about this voluntary carbon market, I'm thinking about the issue of double counting and corresponding adjustments. So the host country, especially, I come from that of the host country, which is need on this issue. You see, if you take our countries in terms of that, the our NDC is very ambitious, but we feel that, even if our country is having that, a potential to that of the carbon market developments and initiates that, but how to, challenge overcomes that is a double counting is that and the corresponding cases regarding to the carbon market projects, because both are, in a relation to that of the emission reduction with that. So the NDC will have, its own emission reduction to that. So how to avoid this issue, this double counting and the corresponding adjustments regarding to that of NDC's line? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who would like to take up this question?
Yeah, I can pick up part of that. I think it's a fantastic question, and it's going to be one that's live on many governments' minds around the world because of the kind of finalization of Article 6 framework that's very likely from this COP. I think one key way to think about this issue, and it's in line with the Oxford Offsetting Principles, but we really need to think about the different role of removals and reductions in this space. So under nationally determined contributions, right now they are emissions reductions pathways. We will get to a stage where there is, in theory, no more residual emissions that can then be used to close the ambition or implementation gap. But we do need removals up to that point and beyond. And so I think it's about getting clear in that space and in that framework for corresponding adjustments about the role of different types of units, both now, but in terms of that net zero trajectory. And I think setting some of that in place now can provide that certainty, again, for the private sector capital to inflow, both in terms of development, but also in terms of purchases.
Thank you, Inji. Maybe one additional question?
Maybe, Mojda, just to add on to that, I think part of also really securing yourself is really coming up with a robust project design framework that really addresses your carbon principles, but coming down to really trying to understand what are the NDC requirements. So what we've seen working backwards at the market right now is matching the needs of the countries, the receiving country needs on the NDC in specific sector, together with how do you design your project as a country to directly have this, opportunity to come up with a mitigation outcome exchange that is aligned with both goals sectorally, or if it is, about technology exchange, whatever it's going to be. I think picking up that from the bilateral cooperation framework within the countries and then working backwards to identify how your mitigation outcomes can address some of those. It comes really on the project design perspective. So we've seen these questions coming up a lot, discussing with various ministries in the host countries.
Thank you, James. Please.
I'm curious, thinking about the demand side, I'm curious if anyone on the panel has an opinion on the potential impact of regulations on claims you can make on this market.
Thank you for this question. Sophia, you want to take this up?
Oh, thank you. I think that's a tricky question, but I will do my very best to respond to it. I think that the regulation of, honestly, most or all of the regulations that we're seeing emerging are very positive developments. We want to operate in a regulated space for one reason, because that way we can feel more safe and secure that the system we're operating in is not only of high integrity, but it's also aligned across organizations and across sectors. And also, in addition to that, regulation actually makes it easier for us to do our job. If we know what the frameworks we need to operate inside are, that makes it much easier for us to make decisions and to move forward in a strategic way. So regulations in general is something positive. And I think the only thing that maybe should be considered is that the market does have a lot of experience. We have a lot of interactions with companies, with clients. We know what the clients want and what the clients need. And we can provide some insights to support the development of regulations. So I think, just going back to something that I said a bit earlier, was having an honest and open conversation and good stakeholder consultations as part of regulatory development is really quite essential, because it means that we can develop regulations that work in practice on the ground, both for the companies that need to operate inside of these regulations, but also from the governmental perspective and the societal perspective.
Thank you. Short.
And we are talking about methodology and regulations for methodology, so standards. At the end of the day, it came out during the last days that also the ICVCM is preferring to unify the standards, that not every organization, huger organization or not so huge organization, has its own standards. So I'm looking forward that we have this unifying also during the next month, latest within the next 12 months, because the market is demanding it very strongly, very, very strongly. And that's accepted, that's reflected by the different stakeholders discussing it. And if I'm look back to the discussions of the past days, then I'm optimistic as well in this point, yes.
Thank you very much, Peter, for sharing this additional point with us. Unfortunately, we have to clear the room. The next session is starting in a few minutes, but I would like to thank all of you for being with us here, and especially a great thank you to you all for joining us here at this session and for this interactive dialogue. I'm sure that the panelists will be available outside of the room for additional questions. And yeah, thank you all for being with us here, and just join me for a little applause for the audience.